quite nice to kill these lights, perhaps. Danny, is that okay?
Yeah, actually, it's on that switch there.
Okay. All right. Well, obviously, this lecture is on the occasion of the second major exhibition on Le Corbusier in 21 years. 1987 was the last exhibition at the Hayward, and so the present large exhibition being mounted at the Barbican across the road, which, you know, if you haven't seen, I'm sure you'll all go and see in the near future. It's terrific. It probably doesn't need saying, but I'll say it. He's a giant. There's nobody near him. There's nobody near him. He's above all the others because of what he thinks, as much as for his achievement. At one point he says that the purpose of architecture is to make emotional relationships through the uses of physical material. You know, and one can't think that any other architect has been able to see that intensely, his connection with his craft. So just at the set-off, let's just make that clear, that if at any point I say anything derogatory about him, it will be in that context. It is so big, it doesn't matter. All right. I'm not going to talk about the formal element, the formal influence of Corbusier on Golden Lane, because I think it's late, really. The actual built form, it probably is just on this little on the end building where, you know, you can say Le Petit Maison du Weekend was responsible for these curved forms and the curved roof line running back into the building. I guess you could say that. I think that's about all that's all you can say about the actual physical form of the buildings being influenced by Corbusier. Anyway, just to get it out of the way, it's the reason why this part of the estate is two star graded, because it has this sort of direct relationship, and also I think because it begins to show this incessant hammering the treatment that the concrete gets treated to when the practice comes to do the Barbican. All right. So I'm going to talk about his ideas about the city. His ideas about the city. I think it is again a sort of a measure of his stature is that he probably didn't like cities. There's certainly no evidence in anything he ever wrote that he liked cities. There's a lot of evidence that he didn't like it. He didn't really like cities. Certainly the old city, the old form of city, and he repeatedly uses, you know, Paris as a bad example. And when he goes to New York, he hates New York. So there's sort of, but it's probably again a point of his standing. Nobody questions this, I don't think. Nobody says he doesn't like cities. But there's no evidence that he did like them, particularly. And, you know, when he writes, which I think is his masterpiece, really, the Radiant City, La Ville Radieuse. You know, his generators for the city are the sun, space, and greenery. You know, which I mean, that's a good prescription for a bit of countryside, and you know. But more surprising, maybe you know, maybe it's well just to say that. But I think this is his great book, and it follows on from his other book, which is nearly as good and in a way earlier, so certainly to historians, perhaps more important, from Vers and Architecture, Towards an Architecture. It's sort of got a funny history. It's published in 1937 in France, but doesn't get published in 1933 in France, and gets published in 67 in England. So it's peculiar that it's great tone, which is close as I've ever come to a book that he puts everything he's ever thought into it. It's like a book which is, if ever you've tried to do it, it's a very, very difficult task. Very difficult task, and it's a sort of a task that only really a great genius can do. But I think it's true of that book. It's like a catalogue of everything he's ever thought about the subject of architecture. And peculiarly, it doesn't get translated into English until '67, the Orion Press. But it's reasonable to say, certainly with Chamberlain, Powell and Bond, obviously Christophe Bon, I suppose speaking French as a first language, and I would have thought to every architect is aware of this publication. This is the map of La Ville Radieuse, the radiant city that he devises through this. Through the workings of the book, and just to get this is a quote from his earlier book, from Vers and Architecture, which in French is simply called Towards an Architecture, but in English is called Towards a New Architecture. And I think that's just a sort of slightly significant point. To him, it wasn't particularly new. He was establishing something that was always his references in Towards an Architecture. In particular, anybody will know are to, for instance, Greek temples and to Rome. It's a pretty good way to kick off something that's so revolutionary and modern. And here's just a touch of his from Towards a New Architecture. A great epoch has begun. There exists a new spirit. There exists a mass of work conceived in the new spirit. It is to be met particularly in industrial production. Architecture is stifled by custom. The stars are a lie. So you can see that he has this sort of prophetic air about him. He's speaking as a prophet at this beginning, at this stage. And I think when you come to look at him, you always have to have that in your mind. That somehow, a wonderful man called Tim Ball, who used to work at Kingston, I remember him once saying that he thought buildings were the least interesting thing about architecture. And in a way, Corbusier is a sort of proof of that. All right. Well, to look at trying to compare the two. Well, the way I think that the Radiant City or Corbusian's urbanism gets accepted into England, I think it does have a colossal impact, an enormous impact in England. Is really, one normally thinks of the slab block standing on a site. This amazing patterning which occurs in La Ville Radieuse never gets built anywhere, and one tends to think of really these sort of slab buildings, the unités, and I think it tends to get read in that way in England. You tend to think, as with this sketch of the Marseille scheme, which was going to have 3 unités instead of just the one that was built. One tends to think, this is how you can think of local authorities all over England. This tended to be the format that they were built all over the country, and tended to be the format that quite often, came under attack in the 70s for being degradation of humanity in some way. And you'll see as we go on. But if you look at the blocks, which are Bowater, Bayer, Basterfield and Hatfield, these 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks, which really are the sort of figure in the plan of Golden Lane. They are the major elements. They lack both pilotti. They're not on pilotti. They're buried into the ground. In fact, have basements, and they don't have roof gardens. So in that way, they're truly not Corbusian. Corbusier says somewhere that all human life will be conducted under the pilotti. He has this idea that somehow social life will be conducted under the pilotti of the buildings. And you can see this is an early drawing in the book on the Marseille block, which he publishes almost before the building's finished. There's not a photograph in it of the building finished. You can see it's a drawing from somebody in the office, a German architect in the office, of his idea about the countryside sort of somehow sweeping through underneath, in continuity, a sort of spatial continuity that is basically rural, sweeping through, and people in sports clothes. Just to say that his other huge influence has been on fashion. When you see somebody walking about, miles and miles from a running track in athletic gear, that's Le Corbusier. That's Corbusier's influence. So it's pretty big. All right, so pilotti. So this is a sort of classic pilotti, and I can remember Stanislaus von Muth, who's the curator of this exhibition at the Barbican, at a lecture at the AA. He wrote a book called Elements of a Synthesis about Le Corbusier, which is a really lovely book. He wrote as a young man. It's a wonderful book where he's just tracing what Corbusier was, just looking for the sources of Corbusier's inspiration. And I can remember right at that point him saying, well, it is just a place where dogs pee, he thought, the pilotti. So even the sort of devotee, as early as that, sort of had their questions about this sort of space. And probably the master, I suppose, after La Tourette, I suppose, probably didn't use them much. But you can see at the Unité, when he builds the Unité, and he says himself in the previous photograph to this, that he has made concrete into an architectural material. And I think that's a fair claim. These fantastic sculptural elements are impressive. You probably do know. I mean, it's an apocryphal tale. I think. I don't know if it's true or not, but the rough shuttering that it was built by the workforce in Marseille, who were just, you know, I mean, they just used rough wood, and Corbusier, who had never done anything rough before then,